Welcome to the next session on leadership development in education online. We've had a fantastic week. We've had some great speakers this week. We've had, on Wednesday, we had Dame Alison Peacock, which had absolutely a phenomenal response. Today, we've got Nadine Cotton. I'll be going through just a little bit of what she's covering today. Some people, I've seen a lot of names on there that have been here all week and last week as well, and some new people as well. The questions after the video section, Nadine will be looking at raising some of the issues that you might have researched. She'll look at the thread that runs through some of the questions and dealing with your questions specifically. Having a look at the list, we've had people from all over the world actually that have been hooking into these sessions. On Twitter, it'd be great to see you tweeting hashtag LDeduchat session and where you're from, and if you want to include a shot of your screen as you're watching this. Just wanted to go over Nadine. Nadine's in the trust, and she focuses on quite a lot of teaching and learning across the trust, and she gets involved with staff, gets involved with students, and is having an enormous impact on how teaching and learning is actually delivered in various parts of our trust. The session that she's delivering today is with reference to the new framework. So we've got Ofsted, and the particular element that she's looking at is the new element, which is deep dives. So it's how the information is triangulated, and then as leaders within our schools, how do we best adapt ourselves? Nadine, I'm just going to unmute you if that's okay. I don't know whether you just want to go over anything that specifically you want people to look out for during the video.
Yeah, I'd say, I know there's a huge range of people listening today, so there'll be some senior leaders and there'll be some NQTs and trainees as well, and I guess everybody's got a different perspective on their role within these deep dives. So I think specifically sort of thinking about what that means for you personally, and taking away from this session what things you could be doing to start preparing for that from your particular point of view, really. So I think that's the key thing to pick up. But like I said, there's quite a broad range of people involved. So any questions that are more specific to you and your role, please feel free to ask afterwards.
I was going to say, does it cover, will you be discussing how people at different levels of leadership within a school will experience the deep dive?
Yeah, it's very much based on some work that we've been doing as a trust with a pilot model where we were trying to, I guess, sort of demystify the whole process for colleagues, really. So there's information there about how leaders within a school can start to set up systems and processes that can support staff to develop and refine their practice and what they're doing. But also there's some information in there in terms of certainly the middle leaders' point of view, which is obviously really pivotal in this, in terms of what they should be doing and how they can be developing and supporting their teams within their subject areas as well to be ready for deep dives. So it's relatively broad like that. Okay,
so hopefully it should hit lots of different people at different levels. One of the things that I think, we can say we're lucky as a trust that we've actually had a number of Ofsted inspections under the new framework, and you've been part of some of those, if not all of those, in different ways. Without giving anything away from your video, if that's possible, is there anything that you can say to people to look out for during the video, things that you think are particularly pertinent, that you think actually, when I talk about this, really have a look at this, anywhere that you can reference in the video that there should be looking out?
Yeah, I think, with reference to the two schools that we've worked with in particular that have been inspected under the new framework, there's a couple of slides within there that give some feedback, some key aspects of the feedback from Ofsted that really particularly pertinent to deep dives. So where Ofsted are triangulating their information and evidence from deep dives, the kind of what information that gives them, and therefore what conclusions they come to. So there's some really, I think, pertinent points about real holistic cultures of schools, what the intent of the school is, and how they intend to ensure that that's threaded throughout the curriculum. So I think that they're pretty helpful, I think, as an overview. And also, because those two schools have been successful, you can see where the best practice is and what that sounds like and what that looks like. there's another aspect of the process looking at middle leaders and the next steps for a middle leader who's looking at reviewing their curriculum, where they might start with that, what the best things are in terms of understanding where they're at as a leader, where their department's at, where their colleagues are at. I think that's a really helpful place to start, because I think a lot of the meaty work that happens around preparing for deep dives really does happen with that middle leadership team. And unlike maybe previous frameworks where middle leaders are less involved, they are really central to this whole process. So there's a key aspect on that. And then it goes on really towards more about how as schools we can perhaps adapt this deep dive style of model within our own practices in terms of teaching and learning, quality assurance, and having it something that's actually part of our day-to-day conversations and practice, so it becomes a more normalized way of working, really.
So in terms of, I mean, it's a fluid situation regarding how a new framework evolves. Have you seen any noticeable changes from when it was launched in September through to where the last inspection that we had? Has there been any fundamental changes, or have they been fairly consistent in terms of how they've applied the new framework to the deep dive?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, from our understanding of it, it's relatively consistent. There's definitely some key threads that come through. And again, we'll go through that hopefully in the video, but real key threads that are, aspects, for example, in terms of the importance of reading and literacy are absolutely pivotal. And I think what we have found is when they've been doing their deep dives, they really have gone deeper into really finding out how curriculums are planning reading into their systems. And I think also well-being's come up quite a lot. I'm not sure whether the other schools and colleagues would agree with that, but definitely we're picking up that there's a lot of conversations within the deep dives about how well-being is being planned for as a school in terms of marking and assessment processes, etc. So sometimes these slightly left field questions coming up when you think you're just really talking about subject content and planning, actually more to do with the more holistic kind of cultural systems within the school, and picking up, I think also in terms of when they're looking in lessons and they're watching students, certainly there's a real sense that the teacher's not being watched. It's very much the students that are being looked for, and in terms of the work that they're doing, and picking up on things that might be systematic to the school culture. So if you've got things that are happening within lessons that may say a little bit more than just about that subject area, say something more holistically about the cultures, the attitudes and the characters of students within that school. I think that as it's evolved, it's really interesting how the deep dives have brought all of this to the surface, really. They really do tell you an awful lot about the school as a whole, not just that subject area.
So somebody's mentioned something about SEND in mainstream examples, please. Is there anything in particular that we need to reference on deep dives to do with SEND students within, and also I suppose the curriculum and what they're going to be looking at in terms of deep dives when they're looking at of most vulnerable students?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that we've definitely been picking up, I think certainly from the girls' school, there's a real sense that actually there's a complete inclusion of all students within the curriculum process. There was no curriculum narrowing in any way, and students being affected in that sense. So I think obviously there's very much a very strong emphasis on how we're adapting our practice and how the curriculum is flexible enough to be able to adapt and ensure that all students are able to access the curriculum, but that there shouldn't be any narrowing in any way. I think that's probably the main themes that had come through.
Typical timeframes for a deep dive process?
In terms of sort of doing it within your own practice, within an actual inspection, I mean, it will be over the day, it will be over a few hours, an hour for a meeting with the subject leaders, an hour for doing the deep dive visits, lesson visits, an hour for looking at books, and an hour for speaking for students. So when we've done it in terms of our own quality assurance within schools, we've typically planned it around a day, and typically planned it around the same series of activities that you would see in an Ofsted deep dive. So you're prepared, you understand how that feels and how the process works. So typically the meeting with the subject leader is typically an hour long. Obviously it depends on how many subjects they're doing, and they'll obviously divide up between them in terms of inspectors. And sometimes they go beyond that day. So I know that in the boys' school, for example, they actually asked for further work scrutiny after the end of the school day. They'd picked up some strands of inquiry and wanted to look further, so asked for all the books to be handed in for a particular year group of particular subjects, and then went beyond that. So I think the day is pretty much taken up with a subject deep dive, really, in terms to gather all the evidence. Would you recommend a subject leader has it placed from a document, has in place in terms of document perspective and preparation? I think that's a really good question, Joseph, thank you. I think it's really important that obviously the subject leader is ready and prepared to discuss all aspects of their curriculum. I found it really useful, most importantly, to have the curriculum planning there, so the long-term and medium-term plans, so you can talk through those and show those as evidence of how and the methods that you use for planning and sequencing the learning within your subject. So I think they're typically the most important ones. Often we get asked about, do you need to have data? Do you bring data? My understanding is that typically they're not expecting to see and certainly not asking to see data. However, I think it's been really beneficial for colleagues to consider how they are obviously assessing their students and tracking their students in terms of checking whether that curriculum is having impact and being effective. So there could be you could bring in evidence of how you are analysing and how you're assessing the progress of your curriculum and adapting in response to that. But I think the most important thing is to have those curriculum planning documents there, so it's very easy to talk through and explain. A lot of schools have started to do mappings as well, sort of holistic curriculum physical maps that are, I think, also very easy and helpful to talk through, and I think serve as a prompt for the middle leader as well to remind themselves of areas that they want to talk about. So they're the key documents, I would say.
Brilliant. Okay, so now got the video.
Good morning and welcome to this session today about approaches to planning and preparing for deep dives. I'll start by introducing myself. My name is Nadine Cotton. I work as a leader of teaching and learning at the Chiltern Learning Trust in Luton. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to participate in this fantastic series of CPD sessions, both as a learner myself and obviously today as a presenter. So a huge thank you to Arv and all colleagues within the Trust and beyond for bringing us all together to collaborate, discuss aspects of education on such a varied range of themes. I know there'll be future sessions that will link really closely to the session that I'm doing today, and we'll build from that, such as preparing for deep dives in certain subject areas, whole school reading strategies and so on. So obviously they'll work really well together. I know I've got quite a number of colleagues signed up for the session, from classroom leaders, subject leaders, senior leaders and beyond. So my aim today really is to consider the implications of the deep dive aspect of the new framework from a range of perspectives. But obviously please do ask further questions either within the chat or afterwards if there's something more specific that you'd like to discuss, or from more of a specific particular perspective. Maybe we can talk further after this session. In the context of the lockdown, I certainly think this is a really interesting time to be talking and taking a moment really to reflect on all the changes educationally that we've seen, particularly over the past year, and maybe now to deepen that curriculum work that we've all been so focused on prior to lockdown, but also now to step back and really reflect upon, you know, what that truly effective, coherent curriculum looks like. And it's not easy. I think it's posing some challenges, especially now that we move forward and then after we return from the lockdown, maybe even through curriculum recovery plans, for example. And I think it really is bringing into focus for us now what really matters and the true purpose of a coherent curriculum design. And there's going to be so much that inevitably we're going to learn through this process of remote learning, and I think that, you know, we could and we should be taking that forward into future practice. So I really would suggest that it's a great time now for us to perhaps read through again, discuss, deliberate and refine our approaches, you know, really asking ourselves, you know, have we really got this right for our pupils? So in this session, I want to share with you some key strategies and approaches that we've taken within the Trust and that I would suggest are important to consider when planning and preparing for the new framework. And the deep dive aspect of it in particular, I think it is a real big fundamental change. And that we've looked at that with the schools that I've worked with, and come up with some strategies and processes that we think will really support in the planning and preparing for that. So I'll share those with you. I'd also say that the intention and the purpose behind these strategies and processes are not in fact purely related to being prepared and ready for an imminent or near imminent inspection, but are actually about a wider re-evaluation of the core cultures within schools of leadership, quality assurance, educational provision, professional development, and really above and beyond the purposes of the inspection alone. And we know as senior, within school leadership, it goes much far beyond the senior leadership team. And I think within the new framework, the stronger emphasis on subject leaders really brings that into focus and potentially presents challenges for all colleagues when planning and preparing for an inspection now. This is something that I think we've been really aware of within our schools, and the approach the leaders have taken to support and develop colleagues have been a real priority, and have provided a reassurance that with their subject expertise and contextual understanding of their school and their own pupils, they really are the best placed individuals to showcase their curriculum design and to give it full justice really in the rationale for that design. So I'll go through some of these approaches now, and I would say that as always with these things, they're works in progress. We're continually adapting and refining the models that we're working with, as I'm sure other schools and other trusts are doing so as well. So it'd be really great to hear from others in terms of the approaches that you're taking, in terms of looking at growing it and building this further to be more effective as we go through more and more inspections. I think one key aspect is ensuring that everybody is really clear from the very start and understands what the qualities are of an effective, coherent curriculum, and particularly in the context of your school with your pupils. This is fundamental as a discussion to have from the very start. I think really valuable use of time to get this right from the beginning. I think schools and subjects can spend a huge amount of time writing the most amazing, inspirational vision, statements of intent, but unless there's real organisational shared efficacy behind this, the intent is unlikely to be seen as embedded and threaded through the whole school. There needs to be a real authenticity and integrity to this. It needs to be relatively simple and highly contextual, so it allows every subject to really identify with that intent and see the relevance for them. And once that's in place, really is a process of curriculum reviewing. Through looking at the framework, you begin to identify really key criteria, I think, that can provide a structure for leaders to use to evaluate and adapt their own practice in their own context in each subject area. And I think core to this methodology really is looking at this point within the framework, which particularly refers to the purpose of the deep dive, and really picking up on there this intention that it's about finding that powerful evidence about what the pupils know, remember and understand, really strong pedagogical basis to this in terms of the impact that it is having on our students. And so I think once we've started to have a look at the framework in a little bit more detail, I'm sure other schools have done the same, you start to pick out some real common threads, sort of key areas, core messages really, that if we look at more closely and we spend more time reviewing and improving, I think they can make a real difference. So we've identified the 8 strongest messages within the new framework in terms of that impact on the curriculum planning and teaching and learning as a whole. And I think it's really important when we think about these 8 key messages that you always keep in mind what this means for your school and your pupils in particular. And it's very much individualised. So, number 1 there, I think we've mentioned it already, that starts with a really clear shared efficacy of what this looks like for you and your school. What is the intent for your school? How do you do it? And what impacts are you looking for? And what impacts are you getting, and reflecting upon that. So really thinking about whether that intent is simple and straightforward to understand and people get it. Is it special, to your school? Is it unique and bespoke to your school? And is it contextualised, highly contextualised really? Is it embedded then and threaded throughout the whole curriculum? Is the implementation of that intent really clear to see in all areas of the school? And then obviously, therefore, does that have impact? Do you see the outcomes to that? Both academic, but also in terms of attitudes of students and characters of students. And I think underneath all this, it's remembering that, that real sense of authenticity and integrity that you have underneath this for your school and your pupils. It's very much about doing the right thing for the pupils in your school. So that's fundamental. Secondly, the issue of sequencing of the curriculum comes up, and I think that's where a lot of our conversations have also happened this year, and really understand what coherency looks like in that sequencing of the curriculum. Is it planned and sequenced so that the new knowledge and skills that are being required are being taught before, are building on what's being taught before, and towards its clearly defined endpoints? Do we really understand what the curriculum is looking for, and actually are we improving upon it? So having that very clearly mapped out sequence of curriculum planning is key, obviously. I think subject knowledge comes up next as well. I think it's an area of CPD that is often squeezed out, shall we say, and we don't always have enough time to really embed and ensure that our colleagues have that strength of subject knowledge and consistency of subject knowledge that means that the implementation of these intents is really effective. So ensuring that subject knowledge is strong and leaders provide effective support and CPD to ensure their subject is taught consistently well, and especially for those teaching outside their subject area and main areas of expertise, which is happening more and more, particularly in primary, where you have non-specialists potentially leading subjects as well. So I think it's a real challenge there. The cultural capital aspect of it is something to become very familiar with, but really using this now to think about actually how your curriculum reflects your school's local context by really addressing typical gaps in students' knowledge and skills, and really capitalising on that in terms of what your offer is and what the experiences students are getting within your school and the curriculum. Number 5, thinking about reading and literacy across the curriculum and it being a real priority. We know what difference it makes. We know what enriching understanding of vocabulary, what impact that can have on our students. So really looking at a rigorous sequential approach to the reading curriculum, even thinking about whether subjects have a non-fiction reading strategy. What does reading look like in a PE lesson? What does reading look like in an art lesson, in a geography lesson? And having that embedded in the planning, not just as a tacked on addition, having it as something that really enriches and supports students' access to the curriculum. This challenge of long-term memory, really ensuring that students know more and understand more, it is really about supporting these strategies to ensure that it's embedded in long-term memory, and there are opportunities taken to revisit learning and really embed that learning. There's some great pedagogical practice and theory out there, isn't there, on how to support long-term memory, and I think colleagues are actually quite excited about that and are really interested in it. So planning that into that curriculum and ensuring that's at the core, and thinking about how you sequence your core learning to ensure that students have opportunity to do that is clearly something that is vitally important. And number 7, thinking about assessment being meaningful, really having a rationale for when you're assessing and why you're assessing, really thinking about how assessment is used and thinking about workload, it not creating unnecessary burdens, it actually being meaningful and designed to thoughtfully shape future learning, vitally important. And then the final one we picked up, I'm sure there are others as well, but these are our 8 key ones really, is thinking about how teachers respond and adapt systematically to what they're learning about the students as they teach, identifying those misconceptions through the assessment, through direct feedback, and really responding and adapting their teaching as necessary without making anything over elaborate, and those differentiated approaches that actually aren't very effective a lot of the time. It's very much about that understanding where your students are at and adapting appropriately. So looking at how curriculum planning allows for that and plans for that. So I think what's worth doing now, really, obviously I work with a range of schools within the trust, and all of them are at different points of development and preparation for inspections, but 2 have been recently inspected under the new framework, and I think it'd be a good point to explore what emerged from those in relation to the deep dive process and how we can use that to support planning and preparation in the future. So both schools were classed as outstanding, which is absolutely fantastic. One had previously been classed as outstanding 12 years ago, so there'd been a long gap since the last inspection, which poses challenges in itself. And the boys' school, Chorley Boys' School, and Chorley Girls' School, High School for Girls, was actually double RI 2 years ago. So they've been on a significant journey to now get them to this stage of outstanding. And I think it goes without saying that really these schools are not outstanding just because they planned and prepared for the inspections and the deep dives, which of course they did, but that the culture and curriculum has been grown over a much longer time and is really underpinned by genuine shared beliefs and values that are really pertinent to their individual schools. So their success is very much a longer story, but I think the preparations made really served to fine-tune that journey and ensure that there was real confidence in how colleagues were able to share that story fully and really do it justice in this situation. So if we just go through these slides here, we've got some key messages that came through from the reports in terms of both the schools, and particularly I think that relate to what was found and evidence from the deep dives. So if we pick up some of these key messages here, there's a clear, unique vision and intent at every level tailored to Luton and the community and the girls. So this is from the girls' school. Staff felt there was a common goal. So clearly there's the message there was a shared efficacy. There was discussion going on. People understood what the intent was. Colleagues knew where they were going and how they wanted to implement that in their own particular areas of leadership. Staff really understood that common goal, I think, as well. Curriculum development is strong in relation to that. Strong teaching and thinking. There's no curriculum weaknesses. Pick up things like strong, consistent classroom practice all the way through, and then the impact upon curriculum is strong. Of the curriculum is strong. So Progress 8, for example, is very strong. And then thinking more about further impact beyond the academic, the girls are self-contained, they're empowered, and their character is developed. So that curriculum is clearly harnessing more than the academic process. Beyond that, it's about developing young women, leaders for the future, and understanding how that impacts and empowers them, and how their character develops as a result. And from the boys' school, a similar, but different picture. They're unique. They've got the unique intents within these schools. And you can see the quality of education transform pupils' life chances. I mean, that's an incredibly strong message and is very much behind the intent of the school to ensure that students really have every opportunity they possibly can. The curriculum is rich and well planned. Teachers are highly ambitious about what pupils can achieve, as are the students, and they adapt learning for all. There's a love of reading and it's promoted, and students study a variety of challenging texts. So you can see from the points that have been made here and the feedback that's been given that this is very clearly driven by what they've understood and what they've seen within their deep dives and around the school as well. There's some very specific understanding about the intents and the implementations and the impacts of the curriculum and the experience for these students. So it's really clear to see where these key elements are identified, pulled together from the process of the deep dive approach. So in bringing this back to the process of deep dives, this model, I think, within the framework visually sums up the process most clearly. I'm sure you've all seen it, but it really makes it explicit that the deep dives dominate the evidence gathering activities carried out. And this absolutely concurs with the experiences that we've had with these recent inspections. I think as a result, we are really aware that middle leaders may well be feeling a larger weight of responsibility within the process, perhaps compared to other previous frameworks, and this has certainly been our experience, and is why we've been prioritising the support and professional development for subject leaders, and that's been absolutely vital this year. There's potentially a wide range of leadership and curriculum planning experience within this group of colleagues, maybe especially so, like I said, at primary level, where in terms of some gaps in subject specialisms, for example. So the key clearly is to be to ensure that there's sufficient time is afforded to these individuals and groups and colleagues to make sure that they can be really supported effectively to review and feel ready and prepared for the deep dive process. And particularly by thinking about the 3 I's within the framework. So are they able to articulate and clearly communicate the intent of what they're doing within their subject areas, and why are they doing what they're doing. Start with the why. And once you know the why, everything else will follow. Have they had time to really understand that and share that with their teams and come to the decision about what their intent is, and making sure that's obviously aligned with what the school's intent is everybody involved in that conversation. And then the implementation, so how does it happen? How is it delivered? What pedagogy is employed to ensure it's delivered effectively? How do you assess whether the implementation has been effective, and how do you respond to this? Are teachers supported to deliver this curriculum effectively? So the meat around the bones, how are you doing this? What's the pedagogical strategy behind it? And then the impact. What happens as a result of this? What is the attainment and the progress as a result of the impact of reading levels, for example? What are the destinations of students, for example? And is there evidence of wider impact of that curriculum design on people's attitudes and characters? So having that real base understanding and being able to answer all these questions is something that subject leaders really need to be supported in order to be able to do. So I think they need time. Subject leaders need time to really reflect and to pull together a clear understanding about how they would answer these questions. And as school leaders, do we as a school have a transparent and reflective culture where we deliberately plan opportunities in which these questions are regularly discussed and reflected upon day-to-day processes, such as line management, subject meetings, quality assurance processes, and professional development, so that colleagues can really begin to experience what the process of planning feels like, and they feel really well prepared. So as a senior leader, you don't necessarily need to have that strong subject knowledge of those that you line manage, but you do need to know the right questions to ask, and then to provide the right balance of support and challenge within that. So I think this series of points here in terms of supporting middle leaders to start to review their curriculums and move forward, I think is a valuable one to consider. So starting with that knowledge, do you know as a subject leader your subject, your curriculum inside out? Have you read the programme of study? Do you know the syllabus? Do you know have you RAG rated your curriculum against the national curriculum, the programme of study, the exam spec, the syllabus? Do you know your endpoints at each key stage? Do you know the core concepts and the overarching elements within your subject? What specific knowledge forms do your students require in order to understand and gain knowledge of these core concepts? What do they need to know? What do they need to be able to do? And what do they need to experience in order to gain this learning? And how do you sequence that knowledge in order to allow ideas to build on those secure foundations? And that's very specific to each subject. So understanding your subject inside out as a subject leader is absolutely fundamental, and is absolutely the place to start. Really good basis of just making sure that you've got that solid background of knowledge about your subject. Then you start to really work with your colleagues even further within teams to start to identify what your curriculum intent is, and then really starting to think about how you're deciding what that curriculum intent is. That has to be aligned to the whole school intent, your school, your pupils, but it needs to be something that also aligns to your knowledge of your students, what has been their prior learning, what stage are they up to, where are there gaps in their learning, what does the data tell you about their learning and the impact of the curriculum in previous years. So do you need to make adjustments? Is there something that needs to be taken into consideration there? Is your curriculum intent very clear, and is it shared? Do your colleagues all understand where that's come from and why that's the intention for that curriculum? Maybe for that year it might need to be reviewed each year in that way, so updating it being an iterative process in that way. And is it really coherent? Is there a very clear sequence within that curriculum that really meets the requirements of within your school and for your pupils? So having that conversation is absolutely vital at that stage, and really bringing in that shared efficacy of that subject department to come up and establish that. Once you've got that, then it's about mapping out that curriculum, and that's a skill in itself. And there's some great advice out there about how to map a curriculum effectively, and thinking about, again, what that intent was and how you're going to ensure that you meet that intention through the mapping of your curriculum, both long-term and medium-term. So a great deal of this work that's going on is about refining and ensuring that those long-term and medium-term curriculum plans are really sound and really reflect what the intention is behind them. And that will take some time to do. Within that, you know, you're really starting to check as well whether you've got any gaps in teaching knowledge within your team, and really ensuring that you understand the level of your team in order to be able to deliver that curriculum. You know, it's all very well having the curriculum there, but if you don't have the expertise and the confidence to fulfill it, then you're not going to get that consistency for the students as well. So thinking about reflecting on where your teaching knowledge is at within your team, and potentially planning relevant CPD to support that. And then finally then to plan and action whatever required planning time is needed and whatever resources are needed to put all of this into place. And clearly this, again, it will be an iterative process, because each year you'll reflect on it, maybe even within the year as well, especially if it's a new curriculum. Is it working? Do we need to adapt? Do we need to refine? But I think they're 5 really fundamental good starting points for a middle leader, subject leader to be able to start with, to ensure that they are on the right track with their curriculum and starting to prepare. I think beyond that, you know, those areas of learning for those subject leaders are really important. They're very much sort of more knowledge forms that are more about declarative and procedural learning. Really, the next step of development really is to be taken is decidedly more experiential, you know, that's where I think a lot of the really fundamental learning is going to happen here. And I was just, there's real value in starting to demystify this process. You know, what's this going to feel like for a subject leader? What's a deep dive going to involve? What are they going to be asked? What do they need to show? How is teachers going to be observed? What students, you know, what are they going to be asked? All of those unknowns potentially, if you've not been involved with an inspection. I think it's really important to demystify that. And this has been a really fundamental stage of the development work that we've been doing in terms of supporting on planning and preparing for deep dives. You know, thinking about how you start to build in a deep dive style approach, potentially into the day-to-day culture of professional dialogue within a school, not just because it helps you to prepare for inspections, but because it's really achieving, it's a valuable reflection and monitoring and evaluation tool for your school and individuals. And it's the right thing to do, to be checking that your curriculum is working and that the students are responding to it, and that it's on the right track. So, you know, it really helps you to know exactly where you are and have that transparent picture of it. So I think what we'll share with you now is the process and the model that we've piloted this year. We've worked with the schools, we've evolved and developed, and really about how it sort of naturally started to thread through the usual sort of professional development and monitoring evaluation systems by taking kind of deep dive approach to things like subject reviews, audits, showcases, whatever they're called within the school, and even, you know, further through into self-evaluation, where you have subject leaders potentially using some of these models to start to think about actually where are they up to in terms of their own confidence in preparing for a deep dive. So we started by developing a pilot model within Chorney Boys School, just to work with a subject leader there to, again, just kind of use the deep dive process as a model really to see where that subject was up to, and to give that subject leader an opportunity to see what a deep dive would feel like, and use that for their own development within their own subject. So we took on the model of as you would expect as a deep dive model, and we had different activities over a day that we did this, and we had met the subject leader before just to again establish what the day would involve and demystify the kinds of questions that they would be asked. You know, not wanting to catch them out, it was very much about actually familiarising themselves with the process and seeing, you know, how they were able to respond to that. So we had a meeting with the subject leader. We then visited some lessons and looked at some work within those lessons. We met with pupils from the lessons in 2 different groups actually. We looked at disadvantaged students as a separate group, which was a really interesting process to go through as well. And then meeting with teachers from those deep dives just to find out a little bit more. So just to break this down a little bit, the meeting with the subject leader was very much based on that question, you know, tell me about your curriculum design. open question, showcase it to us, tell us about what you do and why you do it. So thinking about long-term and medium-term planning, and the rationale of their content choices, and why they've chosen to sequence it that way. And we encouraged obviously them to bring their planning along so we could look at that and discuss it and ask further questions about it. And just to give you an idea of the kinds of questions there that we are asking within this pilot study, and also beyond in our experiences of the inspections that we've had, the kinds of questions that are coming up. So, you know, where are the gaps in your subject and what are you doing about them? You know, show me where you cover certain areas of the programme of study. You know, how have you planned your curriculum and sequence that learning of progression and so on. You know, really fundamental questions. I think it really does open up and give the opportunity for the subject leader to be able to explain their rationale behind this, and their understanding about the curriculum that they offer and the design and how they're reflecting upon it and developing it and so on, and the impact that it's having. So really thinking about all aspects of that, including in there, you know, about your team, you know, how do you support non-specialist teachers, for example, in your department? Really, really key. Next stage was then to go into lessons, and you know, the following lesson activity was very much to see and evaluate where that lesson sits in terms of the sequence that the leader has explained to us. So we made sure within our questions with the subject leader that we said, okay, we're going into these lessons, what would we expect to see? What is happening? Is at what stage are they up to in terms of the curriculum? Tell me what we're expecting to see. And obviously then it's about going into those classes and seeing whether that matches up, and really evaluating where in the lesson sits within that sequence, and the teachers and the leaders' understanding of that. Just make a couple of points here about things like work scrutiny of pupils observed in the class. It might be conducted within the class, but very often after the class. I know that Trolley Boys had a big work scrutiny request at the very end of the first day of their inspection, where they got in all the books from certain subject areas. But really looking at, you know, what is observed in the books, did it match with the information seen by the leaders? And I'll go into that a little bit more in the next slide. Also within lessons, picking up and observing pupils' behaviour and attitudes for learning. You know, is there an indication in there, the lessons that we see, of a systemic school culture? You know, what's the thread of attitude and character within the school? And is that something that can be picked up through the lessons? I think it very often is. Just then going a little bit further into the exercise book, some of the feedback that we've had from inspections is very much looking at books for continuity and sequencing of learning. So if you want to know about, you know, what to look for in books within these activities, that's the key aspect of it. Marking and feedback, but obviously there's no expectation regarding how students' work was marked. But they did make the point was that they noted that the rich quality of marking drove the learning, and that students gave real responses to the feedback. So it wasn't just a quick thank you, yes, I'll do more, I'll do better, I'll improve. Their work was corrected and developed upon the response that it had made previously, and they answered more challenging questions, and that feedback fed forward and was evident in future work as well, which is obviously absolutely key. Then very naturally from that, we met with pupils from the lessons. And this is all within that day, and obviously it was great to experience it, because I was coming from the outside, I suppose, into the school. So in terms of the students, I was potentially a stranger to them. They were having to talk to somebody who they didn't know, as well as their teachers. So it did kind of mirror the process of a deep dive somewhat to them, and demystified that a little bit for them as well. Preparing students, I think, is absolutely vital in this. And understanding from the questions that we ask them what kinds of things they're going to be asked. It's very much about finding out how they're building their schema for their learning, and what their recall levels are like within their learning. So here again, some questions that we ask students, the kinds of nature of questions that we ask students. So, you know, it's very much thinking about what are they meant to be learning, what's in their curriculum, what's in their programme of study, and has that been learnt, and has that been embedded in their long-term memory? So checking for learning and asking kind of key questions. Do you know this? Tell me about that, etc., related to the programme of study. So as the person you know, leading this part of the process, you do need to know that programme of study, and I would absolutely advocate that absolutely, if it's not your subject specialist area, that you have read that programme of study back to front, you know what questions to ask, and you can refer to that to make sure you're asking the right questions. Like I said before, you don't necessarily need to know the subject back to front, but you need to know the right questions to ask to make sure that you're checking the right things. Checking that understanding, give me some examples of, give me a fact about, identifying differences and similarities between, etc. Things like, do you get an opportunity to return to work and revise and build that skill later in the year? How is your work assessed, and so on? So you can see the kinds of questions that come through. I think another particular one which is really interesting, where you have a look at some of those core areas of learning that are common potentially to each year group. Like we've got one here such as using a bar graph. What does that look like in each year group, and how does that build and develop and grow and become more sophisticated as you go through school, and what's the student's understanding of that? It's really key. And then meeting with teachers from the deep dives. We didn't do a huge amount of this first in the pilot, but it's something that's obviously growing through the model, and understanding how the curriculum informs choices about contents and sequencing. Do they understand the intent of the curriculum? Do they understand the structure and the sequencing of the curriculum? And what choices are they making about it? If students are not progressing to the level they need them to be and reaching those endpoints, what are they doing about it? What is their understanding of that? So really understanding from the teacher's point of view what that feels like. And again, some questions here. Also thinking, importantly about workload here, what's manageable, what's the policy, and is it meaningful, and so on. So these can kind of unpick some really important fundamental questions. A deep dive is there to find out really what the case is, not just what leaders are telling you the situation is. So that's clearly the model, and at the end there, it is all about bringing that evidence together and identifying the next developmental steps within the pilot and beyond. It's been very much a collaborative approach with that subject leader to help identify what the next steps are. And very often the subject leader is the first person to have identified those steps following this whole process, because it completely unpicks it. And it's very transparent to see, actually, that's great, but that's the area I need to work on. So this is where it's an incredibly developmental tool, both as leaders within the school and subject leaders and staff and pupils, actually to really understand where are you and what can we celebrate and what are the next steps that we can do to improve it. So finally then, just to sort of share some of the questions that we started with, but then how we evolved that. Obviously we divided it into intent, implementation and impact. So we had a real solid thread through there of what we were looking for and what kind of things we were asking. We've since then developed a deep dive model that schools are starting to use in various different ways. You can see a bit more closely on that slide there. Where you're starting to really evaluate and quality assure where each subject's up to. Some are using it as part of their QA processes. Some are using it to begin with more as a self-evaluation tool, as a kind of an audit for departments and subject leaders to look through and think, actually, as a self-evaluation, where am I in response to that question? So that model's been, I think, really helpful starting point for us in the way we want to move forward. And it'll be really interesting to see if anybody else has done something very similar. We use these papers to support our planning on that, really thinking about the criteria that we're going to use and the process of how you assess the quality of education through intent, implementation and impact. And they were really helpful. Okay, so that pretty much sums up what we've been doing, but just to kind of pull it together a little bit, I think these are my sort of 4 key points really in terms of planning and preparing effectively for the deep dive process. Check that you've got a really strong shared efficacy and coherence of that in curriculum intent. Is everybody on the same page? Simple, special, contextual, etc. One of our schools had an inspector that said, actually, what makes this school special is that you would travel 100 miles to see that practice. So what is it that's special about your school? And what would people travel 100 miles to come and see? I think that's really key. Is it authentic? Does it have integrity? So important to start with that. Secondly, that a deep dives process is clarified and demystified for everybody involved, teachers, leaders, and pupils within the school. So important. And that they really feel that they're able to showcase their subject. I know one of our schools has called this planning and preparation process in terms of the deep dive more of a showcase. in terms of actually this is an opportunity to really showcase and show and justify your department as it deserves to be. Thirdly, that the curriculum design is prioritised. Are people really familiar with the framework? Has time being given to prioritise and support the subjects to review and rebuild it? And finally, is there a deep culture of deep curriculum review and development? Is it part of day-to-day discussions, professional development meetings, including opportunities to discuss, refine and review that curriculum design? And does the intent of the curriculum get it right for your school and your pupils? So I'll leave it there, just thinking about your school and your pupils. Obviously, I'd love to hear any other ideas of how schools are approaching this. I hope you found this useful today, and I look forward to having further discussions with you. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadine, for that. There's been a lot of questions coming through, and I see that Nadine's answered well over 60 questions, and there's 44 sitting there at the moment. Where do we start?
I've written a few down. There's such a range of questions, aren't there? Because I think there's so many different perspectives on it. I think one of the ones that's come up that I think is really important with this, because obviously part of my presentation there was advocating trying to include deep dive type models into day-to-day practice in the school to make it familiar and part of everyday practice and reflection and development and improvement. And there have been a few questions about obviously the impact potentially of that on workload and pressure and well-being on staff. And I think that's really a really important key point to pick up, if that's okay, because I think the understanding behind this, it feels like a very done-to approach if we're not careful, where you have a senior leadership team who are looking at quality assuring, quite rightly checking where their colleagues are at, where their departments are at, but that can become quite an onerous process if we're not careful in terms of auditing and checking and having meetings and interviews around it. And I think it is important to have that aspect to it. Senior leaders need to be holding colleagues to account, to check and to challenge and to support them to move forward. But I think we don't want overkill, and this phrase deep dive I think is everywhere. Everybody is so familiar with this phrase now that it becomes potentially something that can become quite difficult if it's overdone. So my suggestion to those who've asked that before would be that actually you probably wouldn't need more than one subject deep dive as a practice each year. I know some schools have got a rolling programme over 2 years, and obviously you'd prioritise departments where you've got newer leaders, a quicker turnover of staff, etc., because you want to check that they are where they need to be and what support they might need. So it shouldn't be too onerous in that sense. But I do want to advocate this as a more of a self-evaluation tool for within departments, that as a subject leader, this is something that could be really powerful for you and your team to really start to identify exactly, study the present, know where you're at, know what you need to change. And I think as a subject leader, certainly you can get a huge amount of buy-in from your colleagues if you share that process and have that transparency of this is where we're at, this is where we need to be. Let's together develop a process and an improvement plan to refine our curriculum and get it to where we want it to be. And I think that should be an iterative process, and that should be a yearly thing at least, that you're constantly reflecting on, did it work last year? Do you need to adapt and change it? So I would hope that the process isn't something that's onerous and isn't something that impacts negatively on wellbeing, but potentially is more of a tool that really helps colleagues to refine their practice in a way that potentially makes it easier for them in the future. So I thought that was quite a key question. I hope that answers that in some way. Also, some things have been picked up in terms of students. I think the student aspect of this process is the bit that most colleagues have been most nervous about. It's potentially the unknown aspect. What are the students going to say? Because obviously inspectors are there to gather evidence whether what the leaders are saying is actually what is happening in practice, and the students are maybe that unknown quantity. And is it important that some people have asked, is it important that students understand the curriculum intent? And I would say actually absolutely. It's a great approach to have. I know that when we did the pilot in the boys' school, for example, the boys were incredibly eloquent at talking about why they were learning what they were learning. We took the strand of looking at analysing text, and they were incredibly good at talking about where they'd got to in primary school, what they then had to do in year 7, because they knew that they weren't where they needed to be, because teachers had articulated that the intent was to improve their analysis of text within English. They could then talk about what that looked like in year 8 and year 9. So it's incredibly powerful to hear students really understanding, having that sort of metacognition of their learning process and where they were in that process. So I think it does no harm at all for teachers to share, be very open and share, this is the intention of our curriculum, this is where we want you to be, this is where we want you to go. I think that's an incredibly powerful thing to do. And I think that can really support students to have, I suppose, a clarity about what they share with inspectors. And maybe added to that, do more student voice like this. It's, you know, we do student voice for lots of different things, but do we really do enough student voice related to the impact of the curriculum, the effectiveness of the curriculum, get students involved in finding out what's working and what they're, you know, what development they'd like to see in there as well. That was an interesting one. When you talk about linking, and this is from Erica, when you talk about linking the subject intent with the whole school intent, I think that's really quite a fundamental part of this. And I think, you know, thinking about whether that's, she's asked whether that's linking to the school improvement plan or linking to more the wider school ethos. And I would say absolutely both. I think, Arv, I know, you know, you've had your experience with the girls' school. That was really pivotal, wasn't it, with the girls' school, in terms of your real clarity of vision for the students in your school, being leaders of the future, ambitious young women. And then that's threaded, isn't it, through every subject. So every subject could show what that looked like for them, and how they designed their curriculum around that ethos to give those students opportunities that would support that and driving it forward. So I think, would you say, that was a key aspect of?
Absolutely. I mean, the thing that really needs to come across strongly is that everybody's singing from the same hymn sheet. In terms of, there needs to be a core strand that runs through the school, and then that needs to be apparent in whichever way it needs to be throughout each part of the school. And I think with the process of the deep dive and the way that they triangulate all the information, it becomes very clear if that's in place or whether that's not.
Yeah, and then I think you would get inspections where they identify strength of practice and maybe gaps in practice, where maybe departments aren't taking that opportunity to see how that would look in their subjects. And you know, we were talking, one of the colleagues, I can't remember the name of the person, I asked about careers and careers being an aspect of this. And you know, that's very much with the Gatsby benchmarks. Each subject should be talking about, you know, what their subject can offer in terms of careers and relating some of their curriculum to careers. So that much broader picture beyond the subject content and preparing young people for life after school, that broader understanding of where students have come from and where they're going to after you, and ensuring that curriculum prepares them for that, I think is really fundamental to this new framework. So that's where you get that real, very powerful message, where you get the same message, like you say, of be singing from the same hymn sheet. And then I think you know, that's true to say of as well, that students, teachers, senior teachers, trust members, governors, and that's one of the strengths that came through from both the schools, is that there was a consistent message and understanding of what the intent was for each of those schools, and everybody knew that, and everybody was part of that discussion, and not just that they'd been told that, but they were part of the evolution of that ethos. And we talked about it having integrity and being authentic, that it was something that isn't just a tacked on, let's do a quick intent that sounds similar to everybody else's intent, but let's make sure it's bespoke and it's relevant for our students in our context. I think that's why I made the point a lot about our students, our school. We're best placed to know, you know, what that intent should be for those students. And I think that's a very fundamental thing that I think would probably separate schools in terms of quality if they really thought that through, and it's very rich. And I think that's where the girls' school have, you know, made that progress so quickly over 2 years, is because that's been really carefully thought through, and been central to every decision that's made after that.
Absolutely. I think the key word there is, when you look at the meaning of the word ethos, that it needs to marry up with what you're saying, and what they see, and it is. I mean, it was quite startlingly clear how close the ethos that we wanted to have mirrored the actions that we were taking as a school, at every level. And it wasn't a scripted, students say this and teachers say this and heads of departments say this. It was literally a belief that this is what we want to achieve in our school, no matter what level you are. And that has to come through really, really clearly. I just want to make sure, so Sarah Tricky, she'd asked, and she had quite a lot of upvotes. Have we covered that? As a head of faculty, how would you go about preparing all members of your team to be able to articulate the relevant information of Ofsted? So are we confident we've covered that?
I think I've answered a couple of similar questions on there. I think it might bear going back to a little bit. I think some of the questions came up in terms of maybe identifying as well those subject knowledge gaps, that how important subject knowledge is within departments. And I know, you know, there's a few more non-subject specialists out there to support and develop. So I think it's really helpful to start with obviously involving everybody and having that shared efficacy of actually our department, our subject, you know, what should our intent be, and getting everybody on board at the start of that. Because what's going to be so important here is that when an inspector goes around a department, they do see that consistency. So if the subject leader has said, this is what is happening in our lessons today, this is what you will see, this is the kind of pedagogy that we're using to approach it. If then you've got somebody who isn't doing that because they haven't necessarily bought into that intention and the implementation planning behind it, you know, that obviously is then therefore showing that students are not getting equal opportunities within that school to access that curriculum. So I think that, I mean, that's number one, getting everybody together with that. Identifying where there are gaps. So I would start with the programme of study, especially if you've got non-subject specialists, and make sure that everybody is completely clear on what the programme of study is expecting, the national curriculum, basic expectations, and then maybe audit it from there, RAG rate it and identify, you know, where are the subject knowledge gaps? Is it individual? Is it more of us that need to work on that? And then you can start to tailor that subject specific CPD. And I think there is a real key point there for schools in general, actually, thinking about how we plan CPD throughout schools, how we prioritise a CPD, that subject specialist opportunity to develop and grow and improve in your own subject knowledge. It may be unfair to say, but often isn't the priority of a CPD calendar of a year. There are other things that start to come into play. Maybe subject team meetings are overtaken by admin work and organisational work, but actually really valuing that subject specific CPD time and making sure it's being planned in and supported. There's real benefits there, I think, also to working within a trust where you've got subject specialism across different phases and different schools that you can tap into to have that support, especially if you're a small subject area like music, for example. There might be one teacher. You need to start building that network and joining those organisations to support that subject knowledge and improvement of that.
As I said, I think it all keeps coming back to the same thing, that everybody needs to have the same voice and mean it and act it. And so I mean, inspections, I mean, I've been involved in them over the last 15 years, and I've seen, like you have, how much they've changed in terms of their emphasis. And it was really refreshing to see, actually, the last one that we had. I was actually looking forward to it. We were ready for it in terms of we knew that we were harmonious as a school. And a lot of the questions that are coming up are to do with that, but there's a lot of stuff to do. And I think, thinking back to past frameworks where the evidence level that was required, now as senior leaders, there is still quite a lot of evidence that it is paper-based. But as we start moving through the school, and in terms of evidence, obviously we've got book checks and stuff like that, and elements like that that still happen. Are there other things, a few people have asked, and on Twitter as well, other things that people need to prepare in terms of documents? So, for example, if you're a subject leader or a head of department or a member of staff, are there things that make the deep dive experience more effective if you've produced something? or is that now not even really looked at?
Well, I think, my understanding of it is that it's certainly not requested and not looked at. I'm not sure if that's your same experience of at the girls' school. I don't think anybody was asked to present any information, but you need to know your subject. You need to know the story and the narrative of your subject area. That obviously ties into the intent anyway, reflecting on last year's outcomes. What did that tell you? Therefore, how did you adapt and change your curriculum in response to that? So having that sort of thorough knowledge of that without necessarily, bringing out loads of figures, your understanding of where the gaps are, where the successes are, and how you're adapting your curriculum around that will inevitably come up in a conversation, because that's all intrinsically incorporated into the intent, implementation, and impact. It's that cycle of, what are you doing, how are you doing it, and what impact is it having? Having that understanding and talking around that. I think subject areas do know that, but it may well be, again, it's that opportunity to share it as a group. You might know your own classes, you might know your outcomes for your own classes and focus on that, but actually as a subject area, holistically, what are the gaps for our students? What areas did they struggle in last year in the examinations? Therefore, what are we doing this year to support that? And having that joined up thinking, I think, as we've mentioned that before, but yeah, you don't need to have reams of paperwork, but you need to know it.
Yeah, absolutely. I can from experience say that's exactly how it came across. And I was also in and about during when the boys had Chiltern boys had their inspection as well, and that seemed to be, and again, depending on what level of leader you are, but definitely when we start looking at middle leaders and staff classroom teachers, the level of paperwork that you feel that you have to produce is probably not accurate. I was going to say, and it wasn't even asked of. It wasn't like it was asked of, but it wasn't important. It wasn't even asked. But we were expected to know.
Absolutely. And I think it's all part of that whole workload paper, isn't it, as well? What are we producing this data and information for? You only need it if you're going to use it to inform your planning and have impact on students. So there's no point in having reams of information for the sake of having reams of tracking information if you're not using it in some way. So I think schools have become much more aware and smart about that, to be honest. But I think that's and where you've got colleagues that have asked about workload, etc., and the questions that have come up about workload within those deep dives, I think that's a really important aspect of it. And I think if schools make sure that they are really sharing and make it explicit what schools are doing to support wellbeing and workload, actually there's quite a lot happening in relation to that. But sometimes maybe colleagues are not necessarily always aware of those decisions that are being made. And I think very much at the girls' school, you were all very aware of what the intention was to ensure that any workload you had intention and was meaningful, and anything that wasn't relevant, you didn't have anymore. So yeah. I think that's a shared message again.
Yeah, I mean, there's still lots of questions that we're not going to get through those. We're now running 20 minutes past our normal time. All I'm going to say is that on Wednesday, we have got Simon Webb, who is ex-HMI inspector, who does a lot of work around the framework as well as deep dives. So I think some of these points that are coming through, we will address in that as well. I'll download some of these questions and actually make Simon aware of those questions beforehand. And I think we've covered quite a lot of the aspects in part. I mean, things like curriculum planning would be penalised if we did X or Y if we structured our curriculum. I think it all comes down to, you've got to be able to justify it. You've got to know your cohort. Your cohort needs to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. Your staff teachers need to know what you're doing and why you're doing it. It needs to marry up with a national curriculum. And at the end of the day, what you see and what you say is got to be observable, and the impact as there's one question there, is an equal balance between the three I's. And for me personally, I think that there is a lot more emphasis on the first two I's, the intent and the implementation, a little bit less on the impact compared to before in terms of the actual headline figures. But I think impact that they want to see within the school, I think, is still important. Am I right in thinking that?
I would say so. I mean, obviously outcomes are always going to be a very key aspect to it. You know, you can't have you won't have great intent and implementation if you haven't got the impact there. It's the result of great impact and great intent and great implementation, isn't it? So it's a deciding factor. But I think in terms of the experience of the day, it is very much upon that narrative of intent and implementation. The conversations, the dialogues that happen are all about that, really, and it just, that then is evidence to show why the impact is as it is. And I think if say, for example, outcomes haven't been great the year before, then it's so pivotal that intent and implementation has been reviewed, and you can clearly explain what is being changed, what's different this year, what have we learned from that, and what are we doing as a result of it. And that could be very powerful, I think, for an inspector as well, that they can see that actually there are gaps, there are gaps, and this is what you're doing about it. So I think that's really key.
Absolutely. So massive thank you to you, Nadine. Thank you for putting up with me this morning and the challenges that we've had during this broadcast. And I was reassuring you beforehand, it'll all be okay. Don't worry about the technical issues. But I just want to thank you. You coped with that absolutely brilliant. And the presentation, as I said, that will be made available. I know there's a clarity issue earlier on. So thank you so much, Nadine. If you want to, while I'm talking, you can carry on answering some of the questions by text if you want to. And I'm just going to now wrap up the session. So just a reminder for everybody else. First of all, next week we have got 4 sessions next week. And we've got Will Smith on Monday, who's looking at leadership of improvement, which is going to tag on some of the questions and aspects that he touched on last week. And then we've got Simon Webb, as I said, who is ex-HMI and has works in an organisation, Minerva, who deals with a lot of the educational-based work around the new framework and delivering as a consultancy as well. And we'll be looking at where we are with the new framework from September. Thursday, we've got Pranav Patel, leadership of perception, bias and decolonisation of the curriculum. And then we have Nikki Goodman looking at deep dives specifically to do with the subject English. So that's next week. We've also got the Twitter is just having a look now, is still active. We're looking at Chiltern TSA. Make sure you follow us. Make sure you use the hashtag LDeduchat. So that's hashtag LDeduchat and follow at Chiltern TSA. And this session with a clearer presentation will be available on YouTube, and a link will be sent to all people that attended today. I thank you for your time. I thank you for your patience. We had, again, a record audience today, and I look forward to seeing you at the next session.